Mint is still $15 a month for premium wireless. And if you haven't made the switch yet, here are 15 reasons why you should. 1, it's $15 a month. 2, seriously, it's $15 a month. 3, no big contrast. 4, I use it. 5, my mom uses it. Are you playing me off? That's what's happening, right? Okay, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, $15 per month equivalent required. New customer offer first 3 months only. Then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
Quiet Riot. Hello and welcome to a Quiet Riot special on the perilous situation on Poland's borders. I'm Kenny Campbell. Even by recent standards, it has been a week of quite remarkable news stories, from the shooting of Charlie Kirk to the sacking of Peter Mandelson. Editors everywhere have been swamped with options for the front pages. So rather than cram everything into our usual 2 shows, we've decided to look at the Polish crisis in this Quiet Riot special with our friend Arthur Snell, whose excellent podcast, Behind the Lines, is required listening for anyone with an interest in geopolitics. And before we start, a quick reminder that you can support our work by signing up at ko-fi.com/quietriotpod if you can. Supporters get access to our Discord channel, plus our live Ask Us Anything video events, one of which is imminent. So, to the situation in Poland.
So together, we, the E5, totally condemn these attacks. Russians' actions are reckless, they're dangerous, they're unprecedented. We see what Putin is doing. Yet again, he is testing us. Yet again, we will stand firm. And my message to Marcin and the Polish people is this. As your NATO ally, we will support you, our Polish friends. As your NATO ally, we will play our part to help secure the safety of your people. And following our discussions today, I've asked our UK armed forces to look at options to bolster NATO's air defence over Poland. Today, as E5 nations, we say to President Putin, your aggression only serves to strengthen the unity between our NATO nations.
So that was British Defence Secretary John Healey, who has asked the UK armed forces to bolster NATO's air defences over Poland after the country was forced to shoot down Russian drones in its airspace, following what he described as an extremely reckless move by Vladimir Putin. Now, extremely reckless is doing quite a lot of lifting there. So what happened? Well, on Tuesday, around about 20, figures vary, kamikaze drones entered Polish airspace. Some of them, at least 8 we think, were shot down. A few airports, including Warsaw Airport, were closed while the drones were in the air, and debris from the drones and possibly a missile was found in different parts of Poland, including areas as far as 150 miles inside the Polish border. Reaction was swift, as you would expect. Poland says it was not an accident. Prime Minister Donald Tusk and Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski and others insisted this was very much a deliberate action. No one is claiming it's reached the level of invoking NATO Article 5 yet. That's the article which treats an attack on one member state as an attack on all. But Poland has activated Article 4, which allows for consultations among member states when one of them feels threatened. EU leaders in neighbouring countries condemned the incursion, as you'd expect, saying it was provocative and dangerous. Many stressed that even if the drones were unarmed, and not all reports were clear, violating NATO airspace at this scale is utterly unprecedented. The UN Security Council is being convened at Poland's request, and there is some debate around what Russia's goal in all of this was, and that's something that we're going to turn to very shortly with Arthur. So Arthur, welcome back to the show. Thank you again for joining us. And before we get stuck in, I should politely first ask how your holiday was. Must seem like weeks ago before we discuss the end of the world.
Yes, I can barely remember it. Thanks for reminding me. No, it was very lovely. But yes, the world carried on carrying on, and here we are.
There's a T-shirt in that somewhere as well. Just carry on carrying on. No brackets. Please don't. Please stop. So you've come back to this sort of chaos. How How big a deal do you, as an expert in this sort of stuff, think this incursion was?
Well, I think there are two deals here, really. There's the incursion and then the reaction, because the incursion, as you've rightly explained there, didn't in itself threaten Poland particularly. Yes, there were, don't let listeners think I'm downplaying it. It was very serious. There was damage done to some properties, but this wasn't an airstrike on Poland by Russia. And in fact, the evidence is that, as you said, Kenny, most of these drones seem to have been unarmed. Now, that's interesting in itself, because when Russia sends drones to Ukraine, they're not unarmed. So that suggests very strongly that these were very specifically drones targeted at Poland. So the idea, the Russian disinformation, that these were a series of drones that sort of went off course clearly doesn't stack up.
Yeah, drones don't do training flights, do they?
No, exactly. So there's what happened, which is ultimately, the security of the Polish state is not fundamentally threatened by this, but the purpose of it was Russia testing the West. And what are they testing exactly? They're testing to see whether or not the United States will stand up for a fellow NATO member when it comes under threat. Right. And I think the answer that Russia will have got pretty clearly is no, it won't. Trump's initial response was this weird tweet where he kind of, as if he were a sort of 16-year-old who's interested in the news, talks about, hey, did you see what's happened? And then he wrote, here we go, as if it's a sort of, spectator sport, which it might be for some people, but not when you're the actual commander-in-chief of the most powerful nation in the NATO military alliance. And then only, a couple of days later, he echoed the Russian disinformation talking points by suggesting it might have been a mistake, which, of course, is what the Russians are doing to sow doubt and confusion around it. So I think the Russians ran a test. They ran a test to see what the response of the Americans was, and they've got a pretty clear answer, which is that America will not stand up for its NATO allies, and actually that the commander-in-chief, the president of America, will echo Putin's talking points.
The thing that occurred to me immediately that I read about this was genuinely, why would Putin feel the need to test Trump? I can't say that I've read anything that suggests anybody is particularly surprised at Trump's reaction stroke lack of reaction. The question would then be, if Putin is testing now, should we be particularly concerned that that signifies a plan to ramp this up in the very near future?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the answer as to why, because, it's a fair point. Anyone who's followed Trump will know that if he's ever given the chance, he'll sort of do what Putin wants. And obviously, most recently with the Alaska summit, you could hardly call it a summit. It was a sort of, disgraceful episode where Trump applauded Putin as he plodded down the red carpet. The reason he wants to do the test is not just to reassure himself about the loyalty he seems to have from Trump, but actually to then create that spillover effect in Europe, because what he wants is to destabilize Europe, obviously. And obviously, if you look at what's happening now, you've got, for example, the very Atlanticist Polish government having to come out and contradict Trump, which of course they don't like to do, because they know that Trump is thin-skinned. They know that he doesn't want to be contradicted, but equally they can't just sit there and say, oh yes, this was a mistake, when their sovereignty has been violated. You've quoted John Healey earlier. You've got defense ministries across Europe scrambling to think about how do you deal with this kind of threat, particularly in a world where we really can't rely on the Americans anymore as an alliance partner. And then you've got the question of, well, does NATO work? What is NATO if the United States actually isn't that bothered when Russia sends a load of drones into Poland?
Which brings me on to my next question, really. I mean, I know that NATO has called a press conference with Mark Rutte, who's the Secretary General, and the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, Alexis Grunkovic. I think that's due this afternoon after we finished recording. We'll obviously pick up anything that happens there on our weekend edition. But do you think, what do you make of NATO's reaction? Do you think they were completely blindsided by this?
I think there's two ways to look at this. In military terms, actually, the reaction shows one of the real challenges that NATO has. So these drones, actually, a drone can be a thing that's almost the size of a fighter jet, worth millions of dollars, full of sophisticated machinery, or it can be something that is not much more than a kind of model plane that, enthusiastic middle-aged men fly around a reservoir. And we're more in that second category. But again, of course, the fact that it's a very basic and cheap technology doesn't mean that you can't create hundreds of them, load them with explosives, and overwhelm air defenses. And of course, that's what the Russians are doing to Ukraine. The Russians have come up with a very clever way of threatening our air defenses. And what's interesting is you've got these drones, as I say, they're basically just model aircraft. And the response from NATO was to deploy multi-million-dollar, ultra-sophisticated fighter jets to try and shoot them down. And that's all we have at the moment. But one can easily see how if the Russians can churn out $100 drones and we're having to put up into the air $100 million fighter jets, at a certain point, the Russians can overwhelm us because we don't have, hundreds or thousands of the fighter jets. So I think on the military side, NATO is facing the way that warfare has changed fundamentally as a result of the Russia-Ukraine war. It is no longer a case that just because NATO had better kit, we always had better kit, and what we might call sort of exquisite kit, which that is no longer necessarily giving us the edge that we thought we had. So that's talking about the military response. Now, talking about the sort of political strategic response, I think it's very frustrating, and I can see, after all, Mark Rutte, people will remember the sort of toe-curling moment when he called Trump daddy in the Oval Office. And, I felt the need to go and shower immediately afterwards. But
ear bleach.
I think if I can just defend Mark Rutte for a moment, I think actually we're in this problem now that obviously it would be very tempting to stand up and say, okay, we're done with this. We are an alliance, we exist to defend each other. And if one of our members is not on board, they can foxtrot Oscar, if I can use that language, the NATO phonetic alphabet. But actually, of course, when that member, you might do that if it's Hungary, or you might do it if it's, Montenegro. But when that member is the United States of America, you can't afford to do it. And you can't afford to do it when the leader of the United States is a thin-skinned egomaniac who is fully prepared to lash out at anyone, including, some country that might be a close ally. So I think NATO is in a very, very difficult position. It is walking a tightrope. It's walking thin ice, choose your metaphor. And it is doing the best it can, whilst frantically, and, to be fair, Europe is doing this, trying to diversify its air defense, trying to invest in new drone technologies. Now, one of the most interesting things of all of this is the fact that Poland and Ukraine, of course, Poland is rapidly becoming one of the great military powers in Europe, with one of the biggest defense budgets in Europe. Poland and Ukraine working closer and closer together because actually the country that knows how to deal with Russian drone attacks is Ukraine. And the future of European defense is not just about investing to help the Ukrainians defend themselves, but it's actually investing to help the Ukrainians defend us. And I'm not asking, Ukraine's got enough on its plate, but actually Ukraine can manufacture the drones that we're going to need. It can manufacture other technologies, and it can do it way cheaper than, Western Europe can. So I think there are answers here, but they're ones that we can't necessarily arrive at in a kind of very short time period.
Quiet Riot. If you've shopped online, chances are you've bought from a business powered by Shopify. You know that purple Shop Pay button you see at checkout? The one that makes buying so incredibly easy? That's Shopify. And there's a reason so many businesses sell with it, because Shopify makes it incredibly easy to start and run your business. Shopify is the commerce platform behind 10% of all e-commerce in the US. Sign up for your $1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.com/promo. Go to shopify.com/promo. Quiet Riot.
It's fair to say that drone technology, it favors the aggressor, doesn't it? I mean, you highlighted how easy it is to build drones at scale at various price points and swamp the opposition. But it's a technology that really does favour the aggressor. Is there any way of putting Russia off that doesn't involve Poland ramping things up to a very dangerous new level?
It's very difficult. So one of the things that is talked about is a no-fly zone over Western Ukraine, because one could make the argument that there is an active conflict in Eastern Ukraine. Now, of course, any right-thinking person, as far as I'm concerned, is completely clear in their minds, where the fault lies for that, who has responsibility. Is clearly Russia invaded Ukraine. Trump seems to be a bit confused by this, and other people can work it out. There is no front line in Western Ukraine. Ukraine is an immense country. The idea of a no-fly zone as a sort of cordon sanitaire, which actually then gives the Russians a red line, which at the moment, because the whole point about this test that they've run is that the line isn't red enough, and they're just trying to sort of put a few toes across that line. So one idea is that you do that, and obviously the no-fly zone is then policed by Western European air forces, and whether or not you give it a NATO label or you give it some other more flexible coalition label is to be debated. There, of course, are risks with that. What if you shoot down a Russian plane? Having said that, Turkey shot down a Russian plane a few years back, a Russian plane that had been operating over Syria and strayed into Russian airspace, and World War III did not occur. A NATO country shot down a Russian plane, and Russia understood that it had violated certain tripwires, and it did not escalate into World War III. So I think one of the issues here is that Putin, when he sees weakness, he takes advantage. And of course, what he's seeing is the extraordinary weakness of Trump, but also there is weakness in Europe generally. Poland itself is standing very firm, and it's good to see allies of Poland doing the same. But there are plenty of countries that are sort of talking about the need to de-escalate, which of course is, it's a very reasonable thing to say. Anyone can agree that we want to de-escalate. But if de-escalating means signaling to Russia that it's okay to stray into Polish airspace now and then, no one's really going to mind, that starts to normalize this idea that, as it were, NATO's frontier is a bit porous.
And that's in many ways the most disturbing aspect of all of this. Given everything else that's going on, and given the fact that Putin has chosen now to carry out this test, in many ways it would be logical to conclude that what would be surprising is if Putin doesn't follow up on this test in some way over the next few weeks. It would make far more sense for him to do this and then grasp the iron and ramp things up, wouldn't it? Which leads me to my next question, really, I suppose, which is, we know that Article 4, the NATO Article 4 has been invoked, but how far do you think we are from seeing Article 5 being invoked? Article 5 is the article which treats an attack on one member as an attack on all members of NATO, of course.
I think we are quite far from that, because I think Putin has sort of perfected the art of this constant needling without risking a full military response. If you violate Polish sovereignty, but in such a way that it wouldn't make sense for Poland to fire a missile at Moscow, that would clearly be a massive overreaction. So this is what's clever about what Putin's doing. But I also think it isn't Poland that is at greatest risk, because Poland is a powerful country. It has a big military. It does have the resources to spend money. And also, of course, its frontier is not, its frontier is adjacent to Ukraine, not to Russia.
Yeah.
Whereas the Baltic states, when we talk about Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and I think particularly of those, Estonia, just because of the geography, is very, very vulnerable. And yes, of course, there are, including the biggest British military overseas commitment at the moment is in Estonia. So it is not that Estonia is defenseless, but what if drones start dropping into Estonia in a similar manner? Again, in a way that we can't quite say it's an act of war. To try to answer your question directly on Article 5, I think there's a lot of fear, and this comes back to Mark Rutte and the statements that might come out of NATO headquarters. There's a lot of fear that if you activate Article 5 and then the United States basically doesn't have your back, which I think is probably a fair assumption
Yeah.
under the Trump administration. If people lose faith in the value of a currency, its value collapses. And it's
right.
not about a real thing. It's not about factories closing or people being out of work. It's that classic that Liz Truss was able to sort of cause the pound to plummet just by looking ridiculous and demonstrating to the world she had no idea what she was doing. If people stop believing in NATO, its value will plummet. And I think that's why there will be an extraordinary reluctance to trigger Article 5.
Quiet Riot.
As a sports fan, I have to confess. Sometimes the game gets kind of boring. That's when I unfold my Samsung Galaxy Z Fold 7 and use multi-window viewing on its large screen. Boring game? I'm checking out my fantasy baseball league at the same time. Score still 1-0? I'm replying to emails in the other window, scoring points with the boss. Semifinals finally getting exciting? I'm buying tickets to the finals and booking my flights. Can your phone do that?
The new Galaxy Z Fold 7. Get yours at Samsung.com. Quiet Riot.
Donald Tusk was at a Polish ammunition factory this morning, and he said that he'd been in touch today with Rutte, and he expects to hear more about alliance action on the eastern flank later today. So we watch what happens there. But he also talked about new investment by BAE Systems, British company, obviously.
Yeah.
That's going to help Poland produce 155mm caliber ammunition. And further, he said that the announcement with BAE Systems is only part of our cooperation with the UK. Tusk said that he'd received another message from Starmer about greater UK involvement in military assistance here in Poland on an urgent basis. Now, he didn't give any further details. The immediate question that occurred to me is, does Britain actually have the capacity and the willingness politically to get involved in this?
I think the willingness is there. And to be fair to the UK, I think, our record, and this is the only context in which I would ever say anything positive about Boris Johnson. I think our record from day one of the Ukraine conflict, and I hope I've been quite consistent on this, our record from day one has been right. That yes, we have limited resources. Yes, we can argue about why those resources are limited. But to the extent that we've been able to do things, we've mostly done the right thing. I think there is the political will to increase support to the eastern flank. And as I mentioned, Britain's biggest military deployment at the moment is in Estonia. So that's already, that's boots on the ground in the real sense. To your point, Kenny, we don't have 20,000 troops, sitting at Brize Norton ready to fly off to eastern Poland. I wouldn't be surprised if maybe we're going to squeeze out a few fighter jets, for example. Maybe, this is pure speculation. I've got no inside track here, but maybe we'll hear more announcements today or whatever, that perhaps that there is some limited further deployment. The other thing that might be, because you mentioned there BAE Systems, it may be that more ambitious collaboration in defense industry is also on the cards. So, for example, Britain is currently developing, in partnership with Japan, Italy, and Sweden, the so-called Tempest fighter jet, which is I think they're calling it a fifth generation fighter jet, so extremely advanced. It arguably may be one of the most advanced fighter jets ever made. But that's a long way off. But for example, involving Poland in that, clearly a country that is rapidly growing its economy, that has a lot of sort of potential in that space, that could be a good idea. So these are just, I want to emphasize to listeners, pure speculation on my part. I think there are limited things we can do. And I think, though, of course, but this comes back to the test, because Putin's test is, the West is weak. What can I do? Now, our response, of course, it would be brilliant if there was a sane president of the United States who was not in Putin's pocket, whose response was to say, this will not stand, I'm deploying the Marines, so on and so forth. But absent that, it is still important that collectively European countries demonstrate, because actually collectively, NATO does have a huge amount of military resource. The problem is it's very disparate. It includes countries that really don't want to be involved. It includes countries like Spain that just don't spend enough on their military. Yeah. But ultimately, if actually a sufficient number of European powers step up and show a front foot in their support to Poland, Putin will read something from that. He won't read enough because it doesn't look as strong as it needs to. But he will at least see that we're not saying, well, I'm sorry, Poland, that actually you've been a bit provocative here, which, that could have happened.
And so that covers Putin versus the West. Can I just zoom out globally? Putin's been hanging out with Xi Jinping of China and Kim Jong-un of North Korea. How do you think that plays into all of this?
Well, I think it's part of why Putin is feeling, a bit cocksure at the moment. Because imagine if someone was giving him a sort of review of September, how's it gone for you, or mid-August to mid-September, you get welcomed with the red carpet on US soil and applauded in a territory that used to be part of the Russian Empire, just to sort of make you feel really warm and fuzzy. And then you get to spend time with all your best dictator friends in Beijing. I think that the way that Putin sort of plays himself in that setting in Beijing is almost, he's the guy who's out there on the front lines battling the West, and China is sort of playing the long game economically, and there's that sense of, you can imagine it's sort of in a friendship group. He's the sort of the tough guy taking the knocks, and Xi Jinping's the guy who's everyone knows is good for the money. And so Putin clearly feels reinforced, feels respected, is reminded that he has very strong allies. On a global scale, this sort of anti-Western coalition certainly has got a spring in its stride. And of course, the biggest thing that is propelling them is the realization that their strategic opponent, the United States, is just completely chaotic and incoherent.
Yeah.
Ultimately, yes, Trump will often talk about how China is a threat and, he's putting tariffs on China and so on. But he is so easily manipulated. He's so incoherent. His economic policies are doing nothing except destroying the US economy. And he's diverting resources to completely pointless activities like creating ICE as one of the world's biggest militaries, whose sole purpose is basically to undermine the US economy.
Yeah.
Now, if you're China, never interrupt your enemy when they're making a mistake, as the saying goes.
And Arthur, this is your speciality, this sort of stuff. Given everything you've said, and given your very sober and realistic and careful analysis of what's going on, the final question is, given everything that's going on in the world, how concerned should we really be about all this stuff?
Well, I think we should be very concerned in the sense that yes, you've got a very weak United States, you've got a hyper-aggressive Russia, you've got China. I wouldn't say China's hyper-aggressive, but what China is doing is taking advantage of the incoherence and fundamental sort of chaos that rules the roost in the United States. Having said all of that, what I think we don't have, and I was asked a similar question the other day, I was a speaker at a sort of conference, I don't think we have world leaders who are dead set on a sort of military confrontation of an epic kind.
That's reassuring, isn't it?
And it should be, because ultimately in the 1930s, you did have that, and people make these analogies to the 1930s all the time. And I understand why, because we are seeing fascistic policies, we are seeing ultranationalism. But the difference is, Hitler really did want to invade most of the world. I genuinely don't think that either Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin or Donald Trump want that. Now, Vladimir Putin certainly wants to invade quite a lot of the sort of ex-Soviet world. So this is not me downplaying the seriousness. We're in very, very serious times. But I think the desire for the kind of, World War III, which really is a doomsday scenario, I don't think is there. However, people do slip into wars. And in a way, perhaps World War I is the example of the war that people slipped into, whereas you could argue that World War II was a war that was desired by the Nazis. We're in very serious times, but I don't think we're in times where the world's leaders, for all their flaws and moral turpitude, where the world's leaders actually want to see this sort of epic conflagration.
That sounds like a perfect and relatively uplifting, all things considered.
That's as optimistic as you'll get from me, so you're just going to have to bank it.
Quiet Riot listeners, we worked really hard to make sure you're not too depressed on a Friday afternoon listening to the show. Arthur, thank you again for joining us. I dare say you're going to be revisiting this occasionally, at least on your own podcast. Let me remind our listeners, it's called Behind the Lines, and it's available in all the usual platforms, and it's going to be becoming part of our family very, very soon indeed. Arthur, thank you very much. Have you anything excited planned for the weekend?
I have. I'm at the happy stage of life where I get invited to lots of 50th birthday parties, and I'm attending one tomorrow of one of my dearest friends, so that's very exciting.
Is this person Russian or Chinese? And did they come with a brown envelope?
No, he's very English, but also a very generous host, so I'm sure we're going to have a good evening.
Fabulous. Well, thank you again, Arthur. Have a fab weekend, and we'll talk to you very, very soon indeed. Bye for now.
It was my pleasure.
Quiet Riot.
Arthur is always such good value, and now, if you find yourself discussing this topic over the weekend, 3 things that you can say with some level of confidence are that 1, yes, of course this was a deliberate act by Putin as a test, a signal to the West, and to his own people too. You can also say, yes, Britain is already involved and committed to further involvement as well. And you can also say, no, we cannot trust the United States to do the right thing. With every day that passes, the need for a strong Europe becomes clearer and clearer. And this isn't about flags and lampposts and graffiti on mini roundabouts. This is about a greedy, calculating aggressor willing the West to show weakness. If you know your World War II history, then you'll know that Polish people are not to be trifled with. But you'll also know that we are all in this together. That's it for this Quiet Riot special. Hit me up on Blue Sky if you've any comments. Just search for Mr. Kenny Campbell. Naomi and I will be back with Sunday School, and boy, do we have a lot to get through this week, including Wokie Dokie action and some grin and share it for those that missed out on those treats in our midweek show. Don't forget to tell your friends about us. Help us on ko-fi.com/Quiet Riot Pod, and most importantly, please do keep listening. We love you all. Bye.
Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads with Naomi Smith and Alex Andreev. Produced by Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangeeta. Artwork by Simona Canelu. And edited by me, Alex Reese. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Sandstone Global.
Quiet Riot.
Okay, so I'm seeing it recording. It's not my fault if it's broken. Alex Reese, if you're listening, you can obviously edit this bit out. I'm getting a t-shirt with that put on it.